The Doll, A Child's Survival of the Holocaust, written by Mikel, illustrated by Elena Kingsbury. Author's note. I first heard Faggy Libman's story as she stood in front of a class of high school students sharing a very painful part of her past, a past that included the loss of her father and the majority of her family members in the Holocaust. She recalled her very early years as a young child, growing up happily with her parents in Kaunas, Lithuania, and the years of persecution where she, along with her father, mother, grandparents, and aunt, were imprisoned first in ghettos and eventually in concentration camps as forced laborers, simply because they were Jewish. She spoke of the precious bond she held with her well-educated and gentle father, along with the strength and determination of her mother who kept them alive. Faggy also spoke of a precious Shirley Temple doll. The day she arrived in the mail was a day to remember. Faggy ripped through the brown paper packaging and tissues in search of her prize inside the box. It was Faggy's birthday, and her aunt and uncle had sent this very special gift all the way from New Rochelle, New York, to her home in Kaunas, Lithuania. As Faggy reached inside the box, her mouth dropped, her eyes grew wide, and her heartbeat quickened. The box held the one and only Shirley Temple doll. Faggy had watched the young actress Shirley Temple perform on the big screen of the movie theater and had dreamed of having her very own doll someday. This gift, this doll, was a dream come true for Faggy. Shirley went everywhere Faggy did. They traveled to the hospital where her mother worked as a surgical nurse. They visited the international bookstore that Faggy's father owned. Shirley went for picnics and buggy rides. She went shopping in the stores of Kaunas and played in the parks alongside Faggy and her friends. Not one of her friends had a Shirley Temple doll, and Faggy quickly became the envy of the neighborhood. Faggy took Shirley everywhere. While Faggy and Shirley were playing games with friends and just being kids, a storm was brewing in the rest of the world. A leader had come to power in Germany, and he was not a nice man. He wanted to only keep people in his country that were like him. They had to think the same thoughts he thought, look the same as the people he liked, and hate the same people that he hated. This man hated Jewish people. He would always blame the Jewish people for everything that went wrong. At first, people in Lithuania thought it wasn't a big deal because he was the leader of Germany, not Lithuania. But this leader of Germany started to take over other countries, stealing land and spreading hate. Leaders of other countries finally had enough of this man's actions and decided to fight back. But fighting back meant war. When Faggy was 7 years old, she learned about this war. She started to see soldiers marching in the streets, but there weren't any bombs dropping. The war didn't seem so bad at first. The real change for Faggy was how she started to be treated. You see, Faggy was Jewish. She didn't realize that being Jewish made her different. Some of her friends were Jewish and some of her friends were not Jewish. They didn't talk about their differences. They argued and sometimes didn't get along. But these disagreements had nothing to do with religion. Once the war started, she noticed that some of her friends weren't allowed to play with her anymore. She also started to notice that strangers would whisper as she walked by on the street. Her father's bookstore wasn't as busy as it used to be, and some of the usual customers who used to bring her treats stopped coming in to browse the bookshelves. New laws passed that said Jewish people, this included Faggy, were no longer able to go to movie theaters or play in the parks. Because they were Jewish, they weren't allowed to own a radio, and they had to turn their bikes into the police station in town. Soon, Faggy couldn't go outside to play with her friends whenever she wanted because it was no longer safe. Despite all of these new rules that were changing her life, Faggy was still happy because she had her mother and father, and she had her Shirley Temple doll. One day, a notice was posted in town that demanded Faggy and her family, along with all of the other Jewish families in Kaunas, leave their homes and move to a different part of town. This move would separate all of the Jewish people from the non-Jewish people in town. Faggy and her family weren't allowed to sell their home. They simply had to leave it. They could only take what they could carry. The day of their move, Faggy's mother dressed her in layers of clothing and told her to choose one item that she wanted to take with her. Faggy looked around her room, but really there was no choice to make. Faggy picked up her Shirley Temple doll. She wrapped Shirley carefully in a pillowcase and tucked her precious doll under her arm. Leaving was scary. Faggy and her family were moving to a part of town that was very run down. The houses in many of the buildings looked like they were going to fall apart. It was scary for Faggy, her mother and father, to leave the comfort and security of their own home, but they were happy to still be together. Some of their Jewish family, friends, and neighbors had already been taken away. Some had simply disappeared. Faggy couldn't call her new surroundings home, but it was a place to live. Her parents and the neighbors called their community a ghetto. There were tall, barbed wire fences built around the ghetto and guards everywhere, which meant they couldn't come and go as they liked. They didn't have running water, there wasn't enough food, so they were always hungry, and there wasn't enough medicine for all the sick people, and there seemed to be a lot of sick people in the ghetto. Faggy, however, still had her Shirley Temple doll. She also still had some of her friends to play with because they had been forced to move to the ghetto as well. Faggy and her friends spent a lot of time together. They weren't allowed to go to school, and many of the adults went to work all day. This meant the children were left alone to fill their days. While Faggy's father no longer had his bookshop, her mother continued to find work. Because there wasn't enough medicine and people kept getting sick, Faggy's mother was always busy trying to help them. Sometimes Faggy would have to go to work with her mother. She didn't really like to go. It meant having to get up very early in the morning, walk a very long distance, and spend a very exhausting day working. There were also always guards around who were yelling and sometimes even hitting people if they didn't think the job was being done properly or quickly. Faggy wasn't allowed to bring her Shirley Temple doll with her on these work days. She missed her doll and she missed her friends. One day, Faggy's mother woke her early in the morning and told her that she had to go to the job site. They dressed and started the long walk to work. At the end of the day, as they were returning to the ghetto, Faggy heard a very sad sound coming from behind the ghetto fence. It wasn't a cry, it was more of a low, whimpering moan. When Faggy and her mother and father entered the gates of the ghetto, they quickly found out what had happened that day. Trucks had arrived and rounded up all of the children and elderly people. If Faggy had been left in the ghetto that day, she would have been taken away too. The sadness was overwhelming. As parents arrived back from their work placements, they came to find their children gone. All of Faggy's friends were gone. Faggy was devastated. She was so angry and sad that she did the only thing she could think to do. She picked up her precious Shirley Temple doll and threw her to the ground. Her precious doll shattered into 1,000,000 tiny little pieces. Things did not get better for quite some time. Faggy was separated from her father. He was taken away, and she never saw him again. Faggy and her mother were moved to even scarier places than the ghetto, where guards who carried guns continued to yell at people and hurt them. Food became even more scarce, and everyone around Faggy seemed to be sick. Many more people simply disappeared. Just when Faggy thought life would never change, it did. The war ended. The cruel guards were replaced by soldiers who tried to help Faggy and her mother. Faggy's mother continued to work trying to help people, but this time she was treated well and had the medicine and tools necessary to help the people who were sick. Faggy and her mother tried to rebuild their lives. They left Lithuania and moved to Canada, where Faggy and her mother both went to school. Faggy's mother studied to become a registered nurse, and Faggy studied to become an accountant. Faggy often thought about her Shirley Temple doll, but never replaced her precious toy. Faggy met a young man named Benny, fell in love, and they married. They had 4 children and worked to rebuild a safe, successful life for themselves in Canada. After her children were born, Faggy went back to school to become a junior kindergarten teacher, and she spent her days in classrooms working with young people. She tried to forget about her painful past and the loss of so many friends and family members. However, the memories just wouldn't go away. Slowly, she started talking about her experiences and sharing her story with others. Many years later, Faggy was sitting at home when she heard a knock on her door. A big red box was delivered to her doorstep. The box was from a stranger, someone Faggy had never met. It was wrapped beautifully with a big red bow on top. Slowly, she lifted the lid and dug through the tissue. As she reached inside the box, her mouth dropped, her eyes grew wide, and her heartbeat quickened. Faggy was taken back to a place of happiness 71 years ago. Inside the box, she found a brand new Shirley Temple doll. Someone had heard Faggy's story and was so moved by Faggy losing her doll, this person shared it with her mother, who happened to be a doll maker. The doll maker recreated Faggy's Shirley Temple doll as an act of kindness to try to fix something that had been broken many years ago in another time and another place. Today, Faggy's Shirley Temple doll sits on her desk in her office. The doll serves as a reminder to Faggy that there are good people in the world. A stranger, someone who had never met her, made this thoughtful gift. Together, Faggy and Shirley travel all over Canada sharing their story of the Holocaust and inspiring hope, showing adults and students alike that goodness and kindness does exist and we all have the ability to change the world.